In peacekeeping, it requires a very cool head. It requires, people who have got diplomatic skills in dealing with various levels of people. When you first, go and meet with the rebel leaders, you will be tense. You don't know them. And sometimes you go there and find people who have been fighting a war for the reasons they believe in, people who are armed to the teeth, people who will not be in a barracks. They are normally in the bush. For example, in our case, in Namibia, if I talk about Namibia, my first meeting with the rebel chief, the rebel leader, President Sam Nujoma, when I first met with him, was in Luanda, in his own small, house, which was provided for him by the government of, I believe, the government of Angola then. I was sent there to go and make contact with him because the war had just broken again. Hostilities had just broken again in northern Namibia. When it should not have been the case. An agreement had been reached that the United Nations was going to deploy now in Namibia, who will see a transition, a 1-year transition towards majority rule. But then the forces of SWAPO and the forces of South Africa had started fighting again. Now we had to go in and talk to both the SWAPO leadership and of course talk to the South African leadership within Namibia to try and find a solution. So that is when I went and met with President Nujoma. So my meeting with him was in a reasonable good area. He was not in the bush. He was in his own house. Although the situation was not as good as expected, he was tense. He wanted to get more information from me because I just flown in from Windhoek, and prior to that, I had gone to the northern Namibia where fighting was taking place. So he was, eager to get information from me, what is really happening there. The next day, he sent me to southern Angola, to go and meet with his army commander in the bush. That was the closest I came to the real fighters, for the first time. When I went to meet with, his name was called Ho Chi Minh. When I went to meet with him in the field, he was armed to the teeth. The soldiers around him, or his troops, were armed to the teeth. My escort, who was then the defense minister of SWAPO, was armed to the teeth. But myself, I was only armed with my walking stick. As a peacekeeper, when I went out there, although I was entitled, to keep, to carry a weapon for self-defense, I made a choice from day one that I will not carry a weapon. Because if I needed protection, I had soldiers. But me as a commander, I decided, I made my own decision in my own mind that I will not carry a weapon. And actually that played a very major role in me feeling much more comfortable. And I believe those who saw me, whether they were government soldiers or rebel soldiers, wondered, how come this brigadier does not carry a weapon? Yeah? I felt comfortable. And as such, even when I went to meet with soldiers in southern Angola, the SWAPO, they were shocked to see me, just walking with my walking stick. And I remember, when I eventually, met again with that SWAPO general who I met for the first time in the bush. When I eventually met him, when he came back to Namibia about 6 months later, he told me, General, I was surprised that you would come to our, headquarters in the bush and you did not have any weapons with you. Do you mean that you are sure that our troops would not do anything wrong about you? I said, because his real name was Charlie. I said, Charlie, you know what? If you ever, your soldiers or you ever, did anything against me, because I was not armed, I don't think the international community would have been very happy with it. Of course, I could have been hurt, but the international community, my government, would not have been very happy with you. I expected you, to behave in a way whereby my life was not in danger. It is not being careless. I knew that, the other side or both sides had a responsibility to ensure that they do not molest peacekeepers. But at the same time, if I really needed, protection, I went with an armed guard. I think I have not seen the UN, as an interference, but I have seen the UN as a body that was formed, whenever it was formed, with very good goals, ideals. But whether the UN has lived, to those goals is what bothered me in certain situations. For example, during the times when we had a lot of failed states, especially in the third world, in Africa, for example, which really required intervention by the United Nations, the way in which those failed states were handled. And I'll give you an example. For example, Somalia. When Somalia failed completely, the international community, responded. The UN responded. But did they resolve the problem? I'm not sure that they did. Liberia, for example. When Liberia failed, there was a lot of reluctance by the United Nations, the international community, to do something about it. In other words, they took their time. When Bosnia, for example, Croatia, failed, when Georgia failed, the response by the same bodies was much swifter, much more, responsive, to ensure that, they solve those problems. The amount of money put in, the number of peacekeepers sent in, the equipment sent in, in Europe was nowhere close to the same with what, for example, transpired in Rwanda. So that is my qualm with, or observation, which, made me feel a little bit, disappointed. In all the missions that I served in Namibia, a little bit in Mozambique, Liberia twice, and Sierra Leone, some of the battles that I fought was, please give us the tools to do our job. When I say the tools, we need men and women, for example, in Namibia, we were lucky, to have succeeded with only something like about 2,000 men and women, on that peacekeeping, mission. In Liberia, I remember the first time I went to Liberia, I was given about 100, military observers, to observe such a huge country, because the international community was not prepared, the UN was not prepared, to deploy the number that I felt as, the chief of that military observer mission, should be given. We were always given, the bare minimum. We asked for more, we didn't get it. So it's, Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone, when the mission, faltered and more or less crumbled, it was as a result of not giving, the necessary tools that were required, men and women, equipment, to deal with that situation. So when I went to now take over that command, we came up with, this is the bare minimum, but we need this, number of people. From 5,000 to 15,000. How could they have, made such a big mistake that when they first deployed this, mission, they said 5,000 was enough, 6,000 was enough. And then the whole thing crumbled. And then when we went on to the drawing board again, then we said, look, the minimum, what we need is 15,000 men. And eventually, grudgingly, they gave us that 15,000 men. So this is what I'm saying. There was some sort of disparity on dealing with the situations in Africa vis-a-vis the situations that I've just mentioned, for example, in Bosnia.